Hey guys, Steinixos here.
So today, we'll be discussing if Luffy is weak to slashing and piercing attacks. Now honestly, I never thought I'd actually need to make this video, and I'm tempted to just say, obviously not, don't be stupid, and end the video right here. But this topic comes up so often that I figured I'd take the time to have a more nuanced discussion about it and log it into the archives. So with that said, let's get into it. Now, like with most other questions, the answer depends on our understanding of the definitions we're using. So what is the definition of weak or weakness as it relates to a character? Well, in the broadest sense, a weakness is some limitation or vulnerability that diminishes a person's strength, puts them at a disadvantage, or can be exploited in some way. So if we were to look at the definition without any nuance, then yeah, slashing and piercing attacks are technically Luffy's weakness, because comparatively speaking, they are among the few things that can actually harm him since he doesn't have immunity to them, meaning this fact can be exploited. However, this view lacks nuance, because even though that is technically true, it does not accurately represent the full picture, nor does it truly reflect how we understand weaknesses in context. Traditionally, a weakness is probably best conceptualized through something like Superman's relationship to kryptonite. Superman, the Man of Steel, is essentially immune to most things due to his vast strength. However, kryptonite doesn't just bypass his immunity, it actively weakens him. Look at it this way. When Doomsday or Darkseid beats down Superman, you could technically say they are his weakness, since they are among the few being strong enough to overcome his defenses and hurt him. But that's not how we typically phrase it. You just say they're as strong or stronger than Superman, and even if you did call them his weakness, you wouldn't necessarily put them in the same category as kryptonite. Why? Because on an intuitive level, you understand there's a qualitative difference between Doomsday and Darkseid simply being stronger than Superman, versus kryptonite being something Superman is actively weak to. Similarly, in the One Piece world, it's fair to say that water is a devil fruit user's weakness. It saps their strength and, in some instances, prevents them from using their powers. In general, they are actively weak to it, though perhaps not to the same degree as Superman is to kryptonite. But now ask yourself, conceptually, does it make sense to categorize Luffy's relationship with slashing and piercing attacks in the same way as Superman's weakness to kryptonite or a devil fruit user's weakness to water? Again, obviously not, because at a level of understanding above preschool, you should be able to grasp that there's a qualitative difference between the two. However, even though you might intuitively understand that there is a difference between these things, you may not fully grasp why it's important to point out that they are different. So, the context surrounding Luffy is that, due to the properties of his rubber-based devil fruit, he is fully immune to blunt force attacks. However, this same devil fruit does not provide him with any inherent immunity to other types of attacks, such as slashing or piercing attacks. So, at a technical level, as we already said, if the comparison were simply between full immunity to blunt force attacks versus not being immune to other attacks, then yes, it wouldn't be incorrect to say that Luffy is weak to slashing or piercing attacks. And this is exactly what people like Kaido mean when they bring this up in the series, especially considering that Gear 5 grants Luffy even greater resistance to blunt force attacks, even when they are coated in Haki, by allowing his body to conform to the shape of the attack. And by the way, this isn't even new, given that Gear 4 already granted Luffy additional resistance to weaker Haki-infused blunt force attacks. We saw this against Doflamingo, where his Haki-coated blunt strikes did no damage to Gear 4 Luffy due to his enhanced elasticity. However, that's not the discussion people usually have, because if it were, I wouldn't be making this video. Instead, what usually happens is an attempt to sneakily place the fact that Luffy is not immune to slashing attacks in the same category as Superman's weakness to kryptonite or Devil Fruit user's weakness to water. And the reason people do this, some intentionally, others unintentionally, is because they want to create the impression that, like Superman and kryptonite, Luffy isn't just not immune to slashing attacks, but that it goes beyond that he's actively weak to them, which is just incorrect. Because again, Luffy is simply just not immune to non-blunt force attacks. At no point in the series is it stated that because of his devil fruit or for any other reason, he is more vulnerable to slashing or piercing attacks or any non-blunt force attack than a normal person would be. To illustrate how silly this idea is, let's think about it with another example. So, just as with blunt force attacks, we know that Luffy, due to his devil fruit, is completely immune to electricity. Now ask yourself, would you then say that Luffy is weak to other elemental attacks? Again, technically you could say this, and it wouldn't be incorrect, because in comparison to a lightning attack, which does no damage whatsoever due to Luffy's full immunity, a fire attack, for example, could potentially harm him since he has no inherent resistance to it. So technically you could say that fire is Luffy's weakness, and you wouldn't be wrong. But again, even though it would be technically correct to say this, you probably wouldn't phrase it that way. Because you know that outside of some rigid, hyper-technical, lack of nuance perspective, the way we actually use the terms weak or weakness in practice implies something that simply isn't true. And in this case, using those terms without proper specification would imply that, like Superman's relationship to kryptonite, or like a devil fruit user's relationship to water, Luffy isn't just not immune to non-lightning elemental attacks like fire, but that it goes beyond that he is actively weak to them. Like seriously, just think about it. Would it make sense to go around saying that slashing attacks are Garp's weakness just because Axehand Morgan managed to cut him, or that explosions are Zoro's weakness just because King's explosion could have killed him? Obviously not. So, to put it simply for those who still don't get it, the reason why it's important to separate these categories is because the absence of full immunity to something does not necessarily mean a person is less resistant to that thing than anyone else. Now, with the principle out of the way, the reason I find this conversation especially silly is because even in the pre-time skip, such as against CP9, before Luffy even had Haki, we've already seen him take slashing attacks that can casually cut through buildings. And even against Kaido, the very person claiming Luffy is weak to slashing attacks, we literally see Kaido slashing Luffy while he's not even defending himself. We can clearly see that his hand is stretched out as he holds onto Kaido. And yet, even in that scenario, even though Luffy is taking some damage, we still see him just eating up Kaido's slashes. And remember, these are the same slashes that cut off Kiku's arm while she was actively defending herself with her sword and in a full set of armor. Yet Luffy, while not defending at all and all stretched out, is just tanking them. So even if you did think Luffy was weak to slashing attacks, he clearly can't be that weak. But what makes this discourse even more egregiously stupid is the fact that Armament Haki exists. So as a basic refresher, Armament Haki is one of the 3 forms of Haki, allowing a person to use their Haki as a shield. That shield can either coat their body directly, as seen with basic hardening, or extend outward at a distance, as seen with Sentomaru and other emission users. So obviously, even if, for whatever reason, you thought that Luffy's body was weaker than a normal person's body against slashing or piercing attacks, which again, you would have no reason to believe unless you're willfully ignoring all the evidence to the contrary. Even in that case, the mere existence of Armament Haki would automatically shift the question. At that point, Luffy's resistance to slashing and piercing attacks would no longer just be about his base body, but rather it would obviously have to incorporate how strong his Armament Haki shield is. Just as how everyone's common sense seems to magically kick in when, for example, Zoro highlights that without Armament Haki, King's explosion would have killed him, but with Armament Haki, he was obviously able to survive it. And just in case there are people who could somehow not figure out that Armament Haki allows the user greater resistance to slashing and piercing attacks, as it does with every single other attack. In case that was somehow too difficult to figure out, Luffy himself in his battle against Hody Jones tells us that a stronger Armament Haki level grants greater protection against such attacks. Rocket science, I know, and to make it even more clear, we see this demonstrated throughout the series, with probably the best example being against Doflamingo, where Luffy blocked multiple slashing and piercing string attacks using Armament Haki. And let's not forget, Doflamingo's strings are sharp enough to cut apart even a speeding meteor, and once again, even with the same wind slashing attacks that Kaido claimed Luffy was weak to, which again is an attack Luffy literally endured without Armament Haki. Even if you had somehow conveniently skipped over that part, we had still also literally seen Luffy take this same wind slashing attack head on with Armament Haki and completely deflected it. So, is Luffy weak to slashing or piercing attacks? At a super technical level, yes, just like every other human in the One Piece world who isn't immune to these attacks. But practically, based on what we actually mean when we use the term, no, he obviously isn't. But anyway, that's the video guys. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section down below. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. But anyway, see you guys next time.